He was a single dad on a final delivery run, running on fumes, both in his truck and in life, when he saw her, a pregnant woman, collapsed in the middle of the desert, miles from anything or anyone. What began as an act of kindness became the miracle none of them saw coming. If stories of resilience and unexpected grace speak to your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. We share true-to-life tales that restore faith in family, in love, and in the goodness still left in this world. Now let me take you to the very moment where it all began. The sun was already sinking low over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the baked earth as Jack Whitaker tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The dashboard of his aging Freightliner buzzed with a loose wire, and the heat had long since turned the cab into an oven. Jack wiped his brow with the sleeve of his flannel shirt and glanced at the photo taped to the dash, his daughter Ella, 10 years old, smiling wide despite the oxygen tubing hooked under her nose. He had one more delivery to make. The pay from this job would cover the deposit for Ella's heart surgery. He couldn't afford delays. Every mile brought him closer to the hospital. Every hour mattered. But even more than that, this last drive was all he had left to offer. After losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, Jack had clung to his job and his daughter like twin anchors. He hadn't let himself need anyone or be needed by anyone. Since the road ahead shimmered in the distance, miles of emptiness broken only by dust devils and distant silhouettes of desert brush. Jack adjusted the radio hoping for static or company, instead silence. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a bundle of rags on the side of the road, lopsided, unmoving. But as he approached, Jack's instincts as a former firefighter kicked in. That wasn't debris, it was a person. He pulled over with a groan of the brakes and jumped down from the cab, boots crunching the scorched gravel. The heat hit him like a wave, searing the inside of his throat with every breath. As he neared the figure, he saw her slumped against a rust-colored rock, her arms curled protectively around her swollen belly. A pregnant woman, alone. In the middle of the desert, Jack knelt beside her, gently tapping her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes dry and rimmed with red. Her lips were cracked. She tried to speak, but only a faint rasp escaped. Jack didn't wait. He uncapped his thermos, his last remaining water, and held it to her lips. She drank in shallow sips, her hands trembling as they clutched the metal. When she finished, she leaned back and closed her eyes, whispering. "Thank you," Jack exhaled. "What happened?" "Are you hurt?" "I walked," she said hoarsely, "from Silver Ridge. They wouldn't let me stay." Jack's brow furrowed. Silver Ridge was nearly 20 miles back. She had walked through the desert in her condition alone, in blistering heat. He didn't press for more. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, but her knees buckled. Jack caught her before she hit the ground. "All right," he murmured. "We'll figure this out." He carried her light, too light, back to the truck and helped her into the passenger seat. She flinched at first, but didn't resist. Once inside, she leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. "I'm Jack," he said, offering his hand. Once he settled in beside her, "Grace," she whispered, eyes still closed. They drove in silence for nearly a mile before the engine stuttered. Jack cursed under his breath. The temperature gauge was in the red. The warning lights blinked like fireflies. The old engine wheezed, sputtered, and finally died with a sad metallic cough. He turned the key again. Nothing. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel and looked at Grace. She hadn't stirred. Her breathing was shallow. "Of course," he muttered. "Of all the places to break down." Jack climbed out and popped the hood. A blast of steam met his face. The radiator hose had split. No tools, no parts, no help. The desert stretched in all directions, like a sea of sand and silence. Back in the cab, Jack sat in the heat and looked at Grace. She looked even paler than before. He pulled the last protein bar from the glove compartment and handed it to her. She accepted it wordlessly. As the night crept in, the desert cooled, but the isolation only deepened. Jack knew they couldn't stay in the cab. Not like this. He set up a makeshift shelter using an old tarp, tying it to the truck mirrors to give them shade. He wrapped Grace in a spare blanket, then sat beside her, watching the stars flicker to life one by one. He should have felt panic, but what he felt was strangely familiar responsibility. Purpose, and for the first time in a long time, Jack Whitaker didn't feel entirely alone. That night, he didn't sleep. He listened to Grace breathe and watched the sky. Somewhere out there was help. Somewhere out there was hope. He just had to make it through the morning. Morning came slowly, dragging sunlight across the desert like a cautious hand, peeling back the edge of night. Jack hadn't slept. His flannel shirt clung to him stiff with dried sweat and grit. The tarp above their heads fluttered in the wind, casting broken shadows over Grace's sleeping face. She stirred. Jack leaned over. "You all right?" Grace blinked against the light. Her lips looked better, less cracked. "I'm still here," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, you are." He reached into his backpack and pulled out the last half bottle of electrolyte solution, handing it to her. She drank slowly, her eyes fixed on the empty horizon. They hadn't spoken much since the breakdown. The silence was easier somehow, like two people carrying wounds that didn't need words. But now, under the brittle sun, silence felt like defeat. "How far do you think the next town is?" Grace asked. Wiping her mouth, Jack shaded his eyes. "Hard to say. 20 miles, maybe. That's if you head west. Can we walk it? With you pregnant?" "No, not unless we have to." Grace didn't argue. Jack stood and surveyed the area again. He needed a solution, and fast. The radiator hose was still split wide open. No tape, no spare. He checked the glove box again out of habit, finding nothing but expired insurance papers and a single red marker. He almost tossed it aside, then paused. He stepped outside and crouched by the truck, pressing the marker into the sand. "Grace," he said over his shoulder. "You ever write your name in the dirt as a kid?" She raised an eyebrow. "What big letters?" "Real big, so planes could see them. Recognition dawned." "You're going to write a signal. Worth a shot." Jack spent the next hour dragging his boots through the sand, using the marker to deepen lines. He wrote one word. Help 15 feet long, wide enough to catch the eye of anyone passing overhead. Then he added a smaller message nearby. Pregnant, no water, simple, clear. Desperate. When he returned to the shelter, Grace was sitting up, trying to braid her tangled hair with shaking hands. "You were military?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "Firefighter. Search and rescue. That explains the tarp trick." He shrugged. Old habits. She studied him quietly, then said, "You have someone waiting for you." Jack hesitated, then reached for the photo still tucked in his shirt pocket. He handed it to her. "This is Ella, my daughter." Grace looked at the picture, then up at him. "She looks like you. Same eyes, same stubbornness, too." A long pause followed. Then Grace handed the photo back, cradling her stomach with both hands. "I was a teacher. 3rd grade, before—" She trailed off. Jack didn't press, but he looked at her differently now, not just as someone he'd found in the sand, but as a woman who once had a life, a calling, someone who mattered. "I used to have this routine," Grace said suddenly, voice softer. "Every morning before class, I'd write the word hope on the board. Just that nothing else." Jack nodded. good word. Harder to live by than to write. They shared a dry chuckle. A few minutes later, Jack stood and scanned the horizon again. The air shimmered. The day would only get hotter. He knew he'd have to start rationing whatever strength they had. "I need to climb the ridge," he said, pointing to the nearby rise. "Might get a signal from up there." Grace frowned. "Is it safe?" "Safe enough." She nodded reluctantly. Jack started climbing the dry slope, feet slipping on loose rock. His legs ached from dehydration, but he pushed on. At the top, he raised his phone. 1 bar, maybe 2. He tried calling 911, nothing. Then he typed out a message. "Stranded near mile marker 84. Pregnant woman in distress. Need rescue." He hit send. The bar vanished. Message. Status. Sending. Failed. Jack cursed under his breath. He tried again. Again. Finally, on the 3rd try, the bar blinked. Green message sent. He stood there a while longer, eyes scanning the vast nothingness. He didn't see planes. No cars. No people. But maybe someone saw their message. Back at the shelter, Grace had used her pocket knife to slice open a protein bar and was mashing it into a paste with drops of water to make it easier to digest. She handed half to Jack when he returned. "You climb mountains often?" she asked. "Only when someone's depending on me." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. That night, Jack laid on the warm ground, watching Grace hum softly to her unborn child. He didn't know the tune, but it calmed him. She had something inside her stronger than fear, stronger than despair. As he closed his eyes, he remembered Ella once asking him, "What do you do when you're lost?" He had said, "You make yourself visible, and you wait with hope." Now lying beside Grace and the child that hadn't yet seen the world, he knew those words had never meant more. Hope wasn't just something you waited for. Sometimes it was someone you met in the sand. The second day in the desert began with wind, dry, biting wind that scoured the sand and rattled the edge of the tarp shelter like skeletal fingers. Jack rose before the sun, checking the makeshift stakes he'd driven into the ground with a tire iron. The wind had loosened one. He secured it tighter, then stepped back to take in their situation. The help sign was still there, etched deep and stark in the sand. No tire tracks, no distant hum of engines, just silence and the wind. Grace was curled under the blanket, one hand on her belly. Her breathing was steady. Jack was grateful for that. She hadn't complained once, but he could see the strain deepening in the lines around her mouth. He crouched beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Morning," he said. Grace opened her eyes, already glazed with fatigue. "Still here. We both are." He handed her a damp cloth he'd soaked from the condensation trap he'd rigged during the night plastic sheet, over a shallow pit, weighted at the center, with a stone, catching what little moisture the desert gave up in the dark. It wasn't much, but enough to cool her forehead and give her lips relief. Jack rationed the last of their energy chews, half for her. A quarter for him, the rest for later. She chewed slowly, then nodded toward the rising sun. "If rescue doesn't come today, we'll manage." Jack interrupted gently. "One problem at a time." Grace didn't argue, but the way she looked at the horizon said she was measuring options, not giving up, but calculating. Jack respected that. He checked the truck again. The radiator hose was beyond saving. He had siphoned the coolant, mostly gone, and used what little remained to keep the phone charged through a solar panel he'd hidden under the passenger seat for emergencies. So far, no return message. But there was still one idea. "I'm going to try a heat distiller," Jack said, tapping the metal panel from the floor of the truck. "Old trick. If I can trap steam and condense it." "Solar, still?" Grace asked. Jack blinked. "You know that. My dad used to take me camping. Army vet. He made us build one before he let us eat our first s'more." Jack chuckled. "Sounds like a man I would have liked. He worked through the morning." Grace rested in the shade, humming softly to her belly. Jack used metal from the engine plate plastic wrap from the tarp packaging and parts of an old first aid kit container. It wasn't pretty, but by noon, they had a crude solar still producing thin, salty drops of water. He offered her the first few drops. "You drink too," she said firmly. He hesitated, then nodded. They sat together under the shelter, sweat drying on their brows, salt crusting their lips, and still somehow they smiled. "Tell me about Ella Grace," said, after a long silence. Jack looked up surprised. He hadn't spoken much about his daughter, not because he didn't want to, but because the words always caught in his throat. "She's 10, loves reading more than breathing, has a laugh, like wind chimes." Grace smiled. "Sounds magical." "She is. She was born with a heart defect. Doctor said she wouldn't see 5. She proved them wrong over and over." Jack's voice cracked. "She needs surgery, not optional this time. It's why I was driving through here. The job was barely enough, but it was all I had." Grace reached over, touched his hand. It was a small gesture, but one Jack hadn't felt in years. "You're a good father," she said. He looked at her. "You don't even know me. I know what it looks like when someone fights for someone else." They sat in silence for a while. The sun shifted westward. The still dripped. The wind howled and eventually quieted. Then, as if cued by some celestial mercy, a low sound reached them. A hum. Jack leapt to his feet. It was distant, but growing louder, a faint pulse against the stillness. He scanned the sky and finally saw it. A helicopter tiny against the heavens, cutting through the air with deliberate grace. He waved both arms. Grace did too. Slowly rising on unsteady feet, the chopper passed, once circled. Then it dipped lower. A shadow crossed the help sign in the sand. They had been seen. Jack grabbed Grace's hand, squeezing it tightly. Her knees buckled with relief and he caught her. They stayed that way, clinging to each other, as the dust kicked up around them and the sound of blades roared in their ears. Help was coming, and for the first time in days, hope didn't feel like a distant idea. It felt real. The helicopter's blades roared above them like the wings of something divine. Jack shielded Grace's eyes with one hand, and his own with the other, as sand and grit whipped up in a swirling fury. The side hatch opened, and a paramedic dropped down with the grace of practiced urgency. Jack heard clipped words through a headset. Vital signs, water pregnancy, dehydration. Grace clutched his hand tightly as they secured her to a stretcher. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. "I'm not leaving without him," she finally whispered. The paramedic looked at Jack. "You coming?" Jack hesitated. "The truck. The delivery, Ella." Then Grace's hand reached out again and he took it. Inside the chopper, the world shrank to a blur of motion and noise. Jack sat beside Grace, her head resting on his shoulder, as the medic checked her pulse and started an IV. The baby was moving, Grace whispered, tapping gently on her belly. "She's strong," she said, almost to herself. She made it through this. So did you, Jack thought, but didn't say it aloud. They were flown to a small hospital in Elko, the nearest town with an emergency unit. When they touched down, Grace was wheeled one way, Jack another. He tried to follow, but was stopped by a nurse. "You need fluids, sir." "You're dehydrated." Jack reluctantly complied. He drank water. He answered questions. He let someone take his vitals. But his eyes kept drifting to the corridor where Grace had disappeared. An hour later, a nurse returned. "She's asking for you." Jack stepped into a dim room lit by afternoon sun. Grace lay propped up on a pillow, pale but awake. Monitors beeped softly behind her. The baby's heartbeat echoed in the background like a distant drum. I told them. "You were family," she said with a tired smile. "Hope you don't mind." Jack sat down beside her. "I've been called worse." They shared a quiet laugh, then silence again. Grace looked out the window. "When you found me, I didn't care if I made it." Jack looked at her sharply. She didn't flinch. I'd lost everything. My husband, my home, my name even. They didn't want his baby. Said it was a burden, but I couldn't. I couldn't just give her up. She placed a hand on her stomach. Then I ended up in that desert, and part of me thought, maybe it was justice. Punishment. Jack leaned forward. "Don't say that." Grace turned her head. Her eyes were wet now. "You gave me water," she said. "But more than that, you didn't walk away." No one had stayed for a long time. Jack swallowed. "You didn't see yourself the way I did. You were walking through fire and didn't even realize it." Grace smiled faintly. "You sound like a teacher. My daughter says the same thing." They both grew quiet again, but this time it was the kind of silence that comforted. Later that evening, Jack stood in the hospital hallway, dialing Ella's nurse. When the familiar voice answered, relief flooded his chest. "She's stable," the nurse assured him, "and excited to hear from you." He waited until the call connected to Ella's room. Her voice was small but bright. "Daddy, I'm here, sweetheart. Did you get the delivery done?" He looked through the glass into Grace's room. "Not exactly," he said, his voice thick. "But I found something more important." "What's more important than your job?" Jack smiled. "Someone who reminded me why I started working in the first place." They talked a few more minutes. Ella made him promise to bring her a story, better than bedtime books. He promised. Back in Grace's room, she was asleep. He sat beside her and watched the slow rhythm of her breath. His thoughts wandered to the first moment he saw her collapsed in the dust skin, like parchment strength flickering behind her eyes. She had fought her way through 20 miles of desert because no one else would fight for her. He remembered what she'd told him earlier. No one had stayed. Jack had stayed. The next day, the doctor announced that Grace and the baby were stable. The due date was still a few weeks away, but the stress had brought on early contractions. "Bed rest," the doctor said, and emotional calm. Jack chuckled. "We'll manage one of those." That afternoon, he brought her a small radio. It crackled with static, but occasionally found a melody between stations. Grace leaned back, listening. "Thank you," she said, eyes closed. "For what?" "For seeing me." Jack felt something shift quietly, deeply. He didn't reach for her hand this time, but his voice was soft when he replied. "I didn't just see you, Grace. I heard you." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, in the desert? Before we spoke, before I knew your name, I could hear you in the way you breathed, like you were telling the world you weren't done yet." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "You heard hope." Jack nodded, loud and clear, and for the first time since they met, Grace began to cry. Not from fear, not from pain, but because someone finally had listened. The hospital room fell into a rhythm, monitors beeping gently, sunlight drifting across white sheets. Grace's slow breathing as she rested. Jack had settled into the recliner beside her bed, feet crossed at the ankles, flipping through a paperback someone had left in the waiting room, but he wasn't reading. Not really. He kept glancing at her, at the curve of her hand over her belly, at the faint bruising on her arms from the IV. She looked better, color returning, energy building, but behind her closed eyelids, he could still see the woman he'd first found in the sand. She was recovering, but not whole. Not yet. Jack's phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. He fished it out and stood, stepping quietly into the hallway to answer. It was the dispatch manager from the freight company, Whitaker. The voice barked. "You missed the drop in Carson City. Clients furious. I had an emergency. You left the load unattended. I saved a woman's life." A pause. Company policy's clear. That truck's on our books. Your run's terminated, and we'll be docking. Pay for the damaged cargo. Jack pinched the bridge of his nose. Understood. The call ended with a click. Jack stared out the window at the parking lot below. Terminated. Just like that. Ella's surgery deposit was gone. The tight knot of survival Jack had carried through the desert now pulsed in his chest again. Different this time. Shame. Frustration. Helplessness. He slipped back into the room quietly. Grace was awake, eyes flicking to him instantly. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," Lydia dropping the phone into his jacket pocket. She sat up a little. "You don't lie, well?" He gave her a wry smile. "I used to. I've gotten out of practice." She didn't press, and he didn't elaborate. But the silence that followed wasn't the kind they'd come to share. It was thicker. Uneasy, the nurse came in with a tray of food, broth, toast, gelatin. Grace poked at it like it might bite her. Jack stood. "I'll grab some coffee." He needed air down in the hospital cafeteria. Jack sat with a paper cup cooling in his hands. He watched families move around him, grandparents, teenagers, parents with sleeping toddlers in strollers. Lives in motion, problems of their own, but they weren't his problem. He was losing everything again. Then came the tap on his shoulder. He turned to find a woman in her 50s, dark skin scrubs under a navy jacket. "You're the one who came in from the desert with the pregnant lady." "Right." Jack nodded slowly. She smiled. "I was on dispatch that day." "You two were lucky we were prepared," Jack corrected. She tilted her head. "Not just luck, then." "Well, I've got a nephew in media. He freelances for Channel 7 up in Reno. I told him your story. He wants to meet you." Jack blinked. "Why? 'Cause people need hope right now," she said. "And you gave it a face." 2 days later, Jack found himself sitting under the harsh lights of a local studio. Grace beside him, her hand loosely wrapped around his. She wore a soft blue blouse a volunteer had donated, and her hair was freshly brushed, falling in waves over her shoulder. She looked tired, but luminous. The anchor, a kindly man with salt and pepper hair, asked questions gently but directly. "What kept you going through the desert?" he asked Jack. Jack looked at Grace. She did. Grace squeezed his hand. And he did. The footage played alongside the interview photos the hospital staff had taken, the help sign in the sand, the makeshift shelter, the still they'd built from truck parts. The camera lingered on the ultrasound photo Grace had saved in her journal, slightly water-stained, but still clear. They told the story together, not polished, but real. And when the segment aired that evening, Jack's phone lit up with messages. Strangers offering money. A retired nurse in Idaho pledging to pay for Ella's surgery in full. A foundation reaching out about emergency aid for single parents. By morning, Jack had more than enough to cover the deposit. When he told Ella over video call, she cried. Not because she was afraid, but because her dad had kept his promise. That night, Grace asked him to sit closer. Her hand found his again. "You know," she said, "when you first found me, I thought I was meant to die out there." Jack didn't answer right away. He watched her fingers trace slow circles on her blanket. "But now, I think, maybe I was meant to be seen." Just once. Fully before everything changed. Jack reached over, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't just see you. Grace, I choose you. Every day from here." Her lips parted in surprise. Then she nodded once slowly, like someone unlocking a door that had stayed shut for years. A beat passed, then 2 words, soft and certain. "Me too." And with that, The signal wasn't broken anymore. It was finally clear. Rain was rare in the Nevada high desert, especially this time of year. But that evening, as Jack stepped outside the hospital to take a call from Ella's surgeon, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. Clouds dense and low crawled in from the west, swallowing the horizon with a slow, ominous grace. The call was brief. The date was set. Ella's surgery would take place in 8 days. Jack stood there a moment longer, staring up at the sky, as the first drops fell soft, cool, almost shy. Then came the scent of dust, waking of air clearing its throat. He had always loved the smell of rain. It reminded him that no matter how dry the earth became, relief was possible. Back inside, Grace was sitting up in bed, combing her hair with slow strokes, her hospital bracelet sliding up and down her wrist. "You okay?" she asked as Jack entered. He nodded. "It's raining." She paused, then smiled. "Of course it is." He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "You ever notice?" She said that. "Sometimes the sky cries, right after you stop needing to." Jack didn't answer, but he moved closer, sat beside her, and rested a hand on her knee. They spent the rest of the evening listening. The rain on the window was soft but steady, a lullaby for the tired and the healing. 2 days passed. Grace's health stabilized. The baby's heartbeat remained strong, but with every hour she grew more anxious. Jack noticed it in the way her eyes flicked to the clock, in the way her breathing quickened whenever a nurse entered the room. "Something's wrong," she whispered one morning. "The doctor says, you're fine." "I know my body," she said. "She's coming early." Jack leaned in, serious. "Then we get ready." They spoke to the nurses. The OB checked her vitals and confirmed what Grace already knew. Labor had started subtle but unmistakable. Too early for comfort, too late to stop it. The hospital staff prepped the delivery room. Jack helped Grace walk the halls, slowly timing the contractions with his watch. "She's impatient," Grace said through clenched teeth after one particularly sharp cramp. "She takes after you." Jack chuckled. "Then she's got fight in her." When the pains came faster, they moved her into the room. The lights dimmed. The machines beeped. The staff moved around them with practiced efficiency. Jack stayed at her side the whole time. He held her hand through every contraction, whispered encouragement. When her strength faltered, wiped sweat from her forehead, and kissed the top of her head like he had every right to. He didn't care that they hadn't spoken about labels. He didn't care that this baby wasn't his by blood. He was there, and so was she, fighting, breathing, refusing to surrender. Outside, the rain fell harder. The nurses called the doctor. Grace's screams turned raw but focused. Jack braced her shoulders, reminding her over and over, "You're not alone." And then, as lightning cracked the sky, and thunder rolled like a long-forgotten drum, their daughter entered the world with a cry that silenced the room. The doctor lifted the tiny wailing girl and placed her against Grace's chest. Grace wept, not with fear this time, or sorrow, but with a joy so fierce it shook her whole body. Jack stood frozen for a moment, watching the two of them, mother and child, wrapped in sweat and tears and something unspeakably sacred. Then Grace looked up at him. "Do you want to hold her?" she whispered. His throat tightened. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "She's not just mine anymore." Jack stepped forward, arms trembling, and took the newborn gently from Grace's arms. The baby squirmed, snuggled into the crook of his elbow, and let out a soft, satisfied sigh. "She's perfect," he murmured. Grace smiled, exhausted but radiant. "Her name is Hope." Jack looked down at the child. "Hope Delaney Whitaker." Grace nodded slowly. "If you'll have us." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead. Then Grace's, "I already do." Later that night, when the storm had passed and the sky cleared, Jack stood by the hospital window, holding baby Hope against his chest. Grace was asleep behind him, hair damp with sweat, breathing slow, and even Hope was wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, one fist tucked under her chin, her tiny chest rising and falling in time with his. Jack looked out over the wet pavement, the lights of Elko blinking in the dark. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the next job or the next paycheck or the next step. For the first time in years, he felt still grounded. He wasn't carrying anyone anymore. They were holding each other up. He turned and walked back to Grace's side, settling into the chair beside her bed. He adjusted the baby's blanket and leaned his head back against the wall. Rain, birth, breath, redemption. They had all come together, like threads of the same fabric, stitched by time, pulled through, pain finished with love. And somewhere in that quiet, Jack Whitaker whispered a promise to the girl in his arms, one he'd keep until his final breath. "I'll never let go of you, either of you." The morning after Hope's birth, the hospital room glowed with soft light, filtering through pale curtains. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet clarity. Jack sat by the window, cradling the newborn in his arms. She was impossibly small. Her skin, the shade of rising dawn, her fingers curling and uncurling like she was still learning what it meant to be in the world. Grace was still asleep, her body slowly recovering from the marathon of labor. Jack glanced at her now, and then making sure her breathing stayed steady, that her brow remained smooth. She'd fought like hell, and now she rested like someone who had earned peace. He looked down at Hope. "You've got your mom's strength," he whispered, "and I'm guessing her stubbornness too." Hope stirred eyelids fluttering as she let out a soft sigh that settled somewhere deep in Jack's chest. He had held babies before, nieces, nephews, a friend's newborn once at a barbecue. But this was different. This wasn't just biology. This was belonging. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, smiling. "She looks good in your arms," she said. Checking the monitors, you'd think she was born into them. Jack chuckled. "Feels like she was." The nurse paused. "Have you chosen a pediatrician? We can help you register her if you'd like." Jack hesitated. He looked at Grace, then at the baby. "We'll need to talk through everything. But yeah, we're keeping her." Something about saying it aloud made his throat tighten, not out of fear, but awe. Later that afternoon, Grace awoke to the smell of warm broth and chamomile tea. Jack helped her sit up, careful not to jostle the IV. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Sore, happy, hungry," he grinned. "I can work with that." She took slow sips of tea, her eyes moving to the bassinet beside the bed. "She okay?" Jack nodded. "Perfect." Grace's voice trembled just a bit. "It doesn't feel real, that she's here, that we made it." Jack leaned in. "We did more than make it. We created something that didn't exist before. Not just her us," she blinked at him unsure. "Us," he reached for her hand. "You and me, Ella, Hope. We're not broken pieces anymore, Grace. We're something whole." Grace bit her lip, then nodded. "I want to believe that you don't have to believe it all at once." Jack said just enough to stay. 2 days later, they were discharged. Jack's truck had been towed and was beyond repair, but an anonymous donor from the news broadcast had sent funds for a replacement. The hospital staff, many of whom had watched the story unfold from the sidelines, lined the hallway to see them off. Grace walked slowly, Jack steady at her side, Hope sleeping in a carrier across his chest. Outside, the air smelled of earth and rain. The world felt new. They checked into a small inn near the hospital, a quiet place with wooden beams and flower boxes in the windows. Jack carried their bags, Grace the diaper tote. Everything else had been left behind in the desert, and neither of them missed it. That night, Ella called. Grace took the phone first. "I've heard a lot about you," she said, smiling. "Are you the nice lady my dad rescued?" Ella asked, her voice chipper. Grace laughed. "He rescued me." "Yes, but I think I rescued him right back." "Good," Ella said proudly. "He needed it." Then Jack took the phone. They spoke of surgery, of teddy bears, of bedtime stories waiting to be read. Jack promised he'd be there by the end of the week. Ella didn't say it, but he heard it in her voice. She missed him. Grace sat beside him on the edge of the bed, resting her head on his shoulder as he talked to his daughter. When he hung up, he turned to her. "I want you to come with me," he said. Grace blinked to see Ella, to meet her, to be part of her world. Grace looked down at Hope. "It's fast." "It doesn't feel fast to me," he said gently. "It feels like the right next step." She didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, "I've never belonged anywhere." "Not really." Jack kissed the top of her head. "Then come, belong with us." That night, as Hope slept between them in a bassinet lined with borrowed linens, Grace rolled toward Jack in the dark. "Do you ever wonder why it had to be the desert?" Jack opened his eyes, adjusted to the moonlight, because it stripped everything else away. Grace nodded, except the things that mattered. Jack reached out and found her hand beneath the blanket. "No," he said softly. "It showed us what mattered." Hope stirred in her sleep as if agreeing, and in the hush of that small room, under the weight of stars and second chances, Jack held everything he never thought he'd have again. A family, a future, and hope in his hands. The drive north toward Reno was quiet, winding through long stretches of faded asphalt and low dusty hills. Grace sat in the passenger seat of their new used SUV, Hope snug in a carrier between them. Sleeping peacefully, Jack kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally drifting toward Grace's knee, a small gesture that said, "I'm here." They'd left Elko early, beating the heat the car packed with essentials. Baby clothes, bottles, a photo of Ella tucked into the glove box, and a playlist of old folk songs Grace remembered from her childhood. As the road stretched before them, Jack glanced sideways at her. She looked out the window, calm but distant. "You nervous?" he asked. Grace nodded. "It's just, meeting your daughter feels bigger than anything we've been through." Jack smiled gently. "Ella has a good heart. She's been through her own kind of desert." "She'll get you," Grace turned to him. "And if she doesn't, she will," he said with certainty. "She's already rooting for you." "You're all I talk about." Grace blushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's a lot of pressure." Jack squeezed her hand. "No, that's family." They arrived just after noon. The children's hospital in Reno was painted in soft pastels, with murals of forest animals and twinkle lights hanging above the reception desk. A nurse greeted them warmly and led them to Ella's room on the 3rd floor. Jack stopped just outside the door. "You ready?" he asked. Grace swallowed hard, nodded. "Ready, as I'll ever be." He knocked gently and pushed open the door. Ella was sitting up in bed, a thin blanket across her lap, a book open in her hands. She looked smaller than Grace expected, pale bird-boned, but her eyes sparkled with a sharp intelligence and something more. "Hope, Daddy," she grinned, setting the book aside. "You're here." Jack crossed the room in 2 long strides, wrapping her in a careful hug. Grace stood frozen in the doorway. Hope in her arms, Ella looked over Jack's shoulder and smiled. Is that her black-turned Ella? This is Grace, and this sleepyhead is Hope. Grace stepped forward, her voice soft. "Hi, Ella. I've heard so much about you." Ella tilted her head. "Are you my dad's friend?" Grace glanced at Jack, unsure. Jack cleared his throat. "She's more than that." Grace knelt beside the bed. "I'm not here to replace anyone, but if you'll have me, I'd like to be someone you can count on." Ella studied her a long moment. Then she reached out and touched Hope's tiny hand. "She's really small." Grace smiled. "She's also really loud. You'll see." Ella giggled. "Good, this place is too quiet." Over the next few hours, they fell into a rhythm. Jack read aloud from Ella's favorite book, one about a girl who tames wild foxes in the woods, while Grace fed Hope and listened. Ella asked Grace 100 questions. "Do you like peanut butter? Can you whistle? Do you believe in angels?" That last one stopped Grace cold. She glanced at Jack, then back to Ella. "I didn't," she said honestly. "But now, I'm starting to think they don't always have wings." Ella looked satisfied with that answer. By nightfall, Jack and Grace were invited to stay in the family room down the hall. Jack tucked Ella in, brushing her hair back, and kissed her forehead. "Will you be here in the morning?" she whispered. "Always," he said. Later that night, Grace stood in the hallway looking out over the city lights. Jack came up beside her, arms folded. "She's amazing," Grace said. "So are you." She turned. "Do you ever think this was all too much, too fast?" Jack leaned against the railing. "Sometimes. But then I think when something's right, it doesn't ask for permission. It just fits." Grace nodded slowly. "She called me her maybe mom when you were in the bathroom." Jack grinned. "That's high praise." Grace wiped at her eyes. "I didn't know how much I needed to be needed." Jack wrapped an arm around her. "We all need to be someone's miracle." A chime interrupted them. Jack's phone. A message from the surgeon. Ella's surgery scheduled for Friday morning, 4:45 a.m. full prep. Jack showed it to Grace. She reached for his hand. "Then we wait," she said. "And we hope," Jack added. "No," Grace corrected gently. "We believe." Jack kissed her forehead and looked out at the night sky. They had broken through the silence. And on the other side of it, they were not alone anymore. Friday morning arrived like a held breath. The hospital was quiet, as if the walls themselves understood the importance of the day. Jack rose before dawn, slipping into the hospital, scrubs provided for parents staying with children in pre-op. Grace sat beside him on the couch in the family lounge. Hope cradled in her arms, wrapped in a lavender blanket. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. At 6:20 a.m., the nurse came to fetch them. Ella was ready. She sat upright in her hospital bed, dressed in a tiny gown patterned with cartoon clouds. Her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Jack marveled at her courage. 10 years old, and still smiling. "You okay, Peanut?" he asked. "I'm ready," she said, nodding. "Promise you'll be right here. Right outside the door." She looked past him, eyes landing on Grace. "Will you stay too?" Grace approached the bed, slowly, heart thudding. "If you want me to." Ella reached out and took her hand. "I do." The surgery took 4 hours. 4 hours of pacing the halls. 4 hours of coffee gone cold in trembling hands. 4 hours of silent prayers whispered, not to a God Jack fully believed in, but to something older. Maybe just love itself. Grace never let go of his hand, and when the surgeon finally came through the doors with a calm face and tired smile, Jack felt his knees nearly buckle. "She did beautifully," the surgeon said. "Textbook. Perfect. You've got a strong little girl." Tears blurred Jack's vision. Grace leaned against him, whispering, "I told you, fighters." They were allowed back into Ella's room once she was settled in recovery. Her face was pale but peaceful. Tubes ran from her arms, Monitors blinked and beeped, but her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Jack sat beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "I'm here," he whispered. Grace stood on the other side of the bed, Hope asleep against her shoulder. They stayed like that for hours. A week later, back in Carson Valley, the house that had once echoed with loneliness was now filled with the quiet, unassuming music of new life. Grace stood on the porch in the golden light of late afternoon, swaying slightly as she bounced. Hope Jack sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, a glass of lemonade in one hand, a letter in the other. He read it aloud. "Dear Hope, you were born in the desert. Not just any desert, but one that tried its best to break us before we ever met you. But you came anyway. You came with thunder behind you and rain at your heels. You were a promise we didn't know we'd made, and now you're here, and everything is different. Love, and Dad." Grace smiled as he finished. "She'll read it someday," Jack nodded. "She'll know everything." They heard a giggle behind them, Ella's from inside the living room. She was curled up on the couch, her favorite fox blanket draped over her knees, watching an old cartoon with the kind of joy that only comes when pain has passed. Grace sat beside Jack, their shoulders brushing. "You're a writer." "Now," she teased. Jack grinned, trying to keep up with the teachers. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that comes not just from peace, but from earning it. Later that evening, Grace brought out a small wooden box. "I made this in college," she said, lifting the lid to reveal folded letters, worn photos, and a smooth pebble with the word "Stay" etched into it. "What's the rock?" for Jack asked. "My husband gave it to me once after a fight. He said it was his way of promising he'd never walk away." Jack swallowed hard. Grace picked it up, held it a moment, then passed it to Jack. "It's yours." Now, Jack turned it over in his hand, and you, Grace, looked at him steadily. I stayed too. That night, Ella asked to sleep on the porch with them under the stars. Jack dragged out the old cushions. Grace brought extra blankets, and they laid side by side. Jack, Grace, Ella, and little Hope in a bassinet between them. The sky above was wide and open, dotted with stars. Ella turned to Grace. "Will you tell me a bedtime story?" Grace smiled. "What kind one about a woman who got lost, but found her way?" Jack reached for Grace's hand. She took it without hesitation. Grace looked up at the stars, then down at the girl beside her, and began. "Once there was a woman who walked through a desert not to run away, but to walk toward something she hadn't found yet. She didn't know what it was called, but she kept walking. Her voice was soft and steady, and the stars kept listening. And in the quiet hum of the porch, surrounded by laughter and second chances, a family stitched itself into permanence. One word, one breath, one miracle at a time." Autumn rolled into Carson Valley. Like a warm exhale, leaves turning burnt, gold crisp air curling around front porches. Raw firewood stacked in careful piles beneath windows. The Whitaker house, once just a stopgap between loneliness and obligation, had grown into something else entirely. Home. On a bright Saturday morning, Jack stood in the backyard with a small shovel and a sapling, a young dogwood with tender branches and roots eager to claim soil. Ella danced around him in rubber boots, holding a watering can twice the size of her head. "Right here?" she asked, pointing to a patch of grass near the garden. Jack looked at Grace, who stood on the back porch, Hope in a sling on her chest. Grace smiled and nodded. "Right there," Jack said. He knelt, digging into the earth with the care of someone planting more than a tree. When the hole was ready, he set the roots inside and patted the dirt around them, firm but gentle. Ella poured the water slowly, letting it soak deep. "What should we call it?" she asked. Grace stepped off the porch, walking over to them. "Let's call it Hope's tree." Jack nodded, planted the week her sister got stronger, and the whole family took root. That afternoon, they invited neighbors over for cider and cookies. It wasn't a party, just a gathering. Jack had never been one for fuss, but Grace insisted that sometimes healing needed to be witnessed. The front porch filled with laughter. Retired couples from down the street brought mason jars of apple butter. A local librarian came with hand-me-down baby books. Kids ran around the yard with chalk-streaked hands. And everywhere there was Ella, beaming alive, vibrant in ways she hadn't been in years. A woman named Claire, one of Grace's old college roommates who'd driven down from Reno, pulled Jack aside. "She's incredible," Claire said, nodding toward Grace. "You know that, right?" Jack looked across the yard at Grace, who was kneeling to help a neighbor boy untangle a kite string from the garden fence. "Yeah, I do," Claire smiled. "And you look like a man who stopped surviving and started living." He paused. Maybe for the first time, Claire leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're going to ask her, aren't you?" Jack smiled, the kind that starts deep in the ribs. Tonight, after sunset, Jack brought Grace out back. The sky was navy blue, brushed with stars. The dogwood sapling stood quiet but proud, catching moonlight on its leaves. He took her hand and led her to the tree. "What's this?" she asked. Though her eyes sparkled like she already knew, Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I don't have a long speech," he said. "No. Perfect words. Just this." He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple, elegant, a tiny diamond resting in a band engraved with two names, Ella and Hope. "I want you beside me, not just in the hard places, but on porches, in gardens." For the rest of it, Grace blinked back tears. "I love you, and I love them. And there isn't a day ahead of me that makes sense without you in it." He knelt not out of tradition, but reverence. "Grace Delaney, will you marry me?" She dropped to her knees, cupping his face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times." He laughed through the tears as she kissed him under the tree. Their daughter had watered beside the soil that now held their future. Weeks passed. Plans were made slowly, joyfully. No rush. Grace insisted on a small wedding. Nothing fancy, just family, a few close friends, a handwritten vow beneath Hope's tree. In the meantime, life kept moving. Ella returned to school part-time. Grace picked up freelance tutoring. Jack was offered a local job managing a small fleet of trucks. Less travel, more evenings at home. They built shelves together in the nursery, cooked dinners as a team, took walks at dusk, pushing Hope in a stroller, while Ella rode her bike ahead. One evening, Jack found a letter on the kitchen table, addressed to him in Grace's handwriting. "Jack, you found me when I was most lost. You gave me water when I had none, space when I couldn't speak, and your hand when I thought I had nothing left to hold. I don't believe in luck or fate or cosmic timing. I believe in choice, and I choose you. Every morning, every mile, every season to come. Love. G." Jack folded the letter and tucked it into his wallet behind the photo of Ella's first birthday and the hospital bracelet from Hope's delivery. As the first snow dusted the garden that winter, Jack stood at the window watching Grace rock Hope to sleep in the chair they'd placed beside the fireplace. Ella was curled on the rug, with a book, a blanket around her shoulders, and Jack, once a man gripping the edge of his life, stood in the center of it. He whispered mostly to himself, "I didn't know this could exist, but it did, and it was real." Spring came quietly to Carson Valley, the way joy often does, after it's been long denied, without ceremony, just presence. The fields were brushed in new green, the last of the snow melted into thirsty earth, and birds returned to perch on the fence posts Jack had once repaired with nothing but borrowed tools and borrowed time. Inside the Whitaker house, Saturday mornings had their own rhythm now. Grace stood at the stove flipping pancakes, while Hope babbled from her high chair, cheeks smeared with applesauce. Jack sat across from her sipping coffee and reading a worn paperback, but mostly watching his daughter giggle at the spatula like it was a magic wand. Ella, now 11 and full of ideas, sat at the dining table sketching blueprints for a treehouse that had at least 3 floors and an escape slide. "Jack," she called, not looking up, "do you think we could build a pulley system for snacks?" He grinned with a snack bell. Obviously, Grace looked over her shoulder flipping a pancake. "Only if someone volunteers to clean up the spilled snacks, I volunteer." "Jack," Ella chimed. Jack raised his mug. "I accept my destiny." It was ordinary. Wonderfully, unbelievably ordinary. And none of them took it for granted. That afternoon, they visited the local park, one of Ella's favorite weekend traditions. Jack pushed Hope in the stroller, while Grace and Ella walked ahead hand in hand, pointing out the buds on trees and the nests tucked under eaves. They stopped by the community garden, where neighbors waved and offered clippings of herbs and early lettuce. "Do we have room in the yard for basil?" Grace asked Jack. Shrugged. "We'll make room." Everything felt like that now. Possible. Expandable. Worth making room for. In the evening after dinner, they set the table for 4. No guests, no holiday. Just because Grace placed fresh daisies in a mason jar at the center, Ella helped fold napkins into neat triangles. Hope was tucked in her bouncer seat, watching with wide eyes. As they sat down, Jack looked around and felt the kind of stillness that didn't demand silence. It invited it. He cleared his throat. "I know this isn't a big occasion," he said, "but I wanted to say something." Grace reached for his hand. "I used to think healing was a moment, a flip of the switch. You go through something hard, and then one day, you're just better." He looked around the table. But it's not. Healing is 1,000 small choices. A glass of water in the desert. A hand held when you don't know what tomorrow brings. A yes whispered under a tree. A baby's laugh in a house you thought would stay quiet. He paused. And tonight, this table, these chairs, you 3. It's all the proof I'll ever need. Ella wiped a tear and tried to hide it behind a sarcastic sip of water. "Okay, Dad, that was kinda great." Grace laughed, leaning across the table to kiss his cheek. Hope let out a gurgle that sounded suspiciously like applause. After dinner, Grace brought out a small notebook and passed it to Jack. The cover was soft leather, etched with vines and stars. Inside were pages of letters, one for each of them. The first one read, "To Ella. I knew you before I met you, in the way your father spoke of your bravery, your wit, your light. You are the first person who gave me permission to belong. I will never stop earning that gift." Love Grace. Jack read in silence, then looked up at her, his eyes damp. "This is our story," she said. "I just started writing it down." He turned to the next page, blank. "For the next chapter," he asked. She nodded. Hours to write. As night fell, they gathered once more on the porch. Hope slept in Jack's arms. Ella leaned her head against Grace's shoulder. The stars blinked overhead, the same stars that had watched them survive, collide, rebuild. There was no grand ending, no dramatic twist, just a quiet that held them like a promise. Jack thought back to that moment in the desert when he gave his last water to a woman he didn't know, and she gave him everything he didn't know he was missing. He held Grace's gaze and whispered, "You were my miracle." She leaned in, brushing her lips against his. "No," she said, "you were mine." And with that, the wind stirred the branches of Hope's tree in the backyard. new leaves rustling like applause from the earth itself. After the stars had settled into their usual quiet watch over Carson Valley and the children had been tucked into bed, Hope cooing softly in her crib, Ella fast asleep with her sketch pad still open beside her, Jack and Grace found themselves on the couch side by side, hands entwined under a shared blanket. They didn't need to talk, but Jack did anyway. "You know what? I never told you," he said. Grace tilted her head, eyes warm. "The night before I found you in the desert, I almost turned the truck around. Something told me to go home early, but something else said, 'Wait.'" Grace smiled softly. That something was Hope. Jack chuckled. "Funny how she keeps showing up." They sat there a while, the quiet wrapping around them like an embrace. Eventually, Jack stood and pulled out a small photo album from the shelf. New, barely filled, he handed it to Grace. "One photo for each miracle," he said. She opened it. The first page held a picture of the desert blurred but real. The second, Hope's tiny fingers wrapped around Jack's. The third, Ella and Grace, baking cookies, flour dusting both of their noses. Grace looked up. "We're gonna need more pages." Jack nodded. "That's the plan." And they kept sitting, watching the fire fade into soft embers, dreaming aloud not of a perfect future, but of an honest one, stitched together with gratitude, courage, and the kind of love that doesn't arrive loudly, but stays forever. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles begin with a table for four. Some stories don't end with fireworks, but with a table for four, a tree in the yard, and the quiet kind of love that stays. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. It means more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about hope, second chances, and the kind of goodness the world still needs, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. We're so grateful you're here. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care of each other.